They didn't execute him with a blade. They didn't drag him before a baying crowd. Instead, they sealed him inside a temple, stone by slow stone, and then simply walked away. There was no formal trial, no sentence read aloud, no opportunity for last words, just the grim, grinding sound of masonry closing over the entrance. Inside, a man stood, breathing air that was already growing thin. The most harrowing part was that he could hear them outside, working with an unhurried, deliberate pace. Even his own mother participated in this macabre act, carrying a stone to the burgeoning wall, setting it in place, and then departing. This man, suffocating in the encroaching darkness, had once commanded every Greek soldier on the field at Plataea. He had decisively broken the formidable Persian invasion. He had saved the very civilization that was now meticulously walling him in. His name was Pausanias, and the journey from being the savior of Greece to a mere body pulled from a sealed temple was a far shorter distance than anyone in Sparta wished to acknowledge. To truly grasp how that vast distance collapsed, we must journey back to a battlefield strewn with Persian dead and the singular decision that irrevocably altered his destiny. Before we delve deeper, this channel has just surpassed 100,000 subscribers, an achievement made possible by each and every one of you. Every view, every minute you spent watching, contributed to this milestone. Thank you. We do not take your support lightly. Now, this is where the narrative pivots. In 479 BC, the largest land army Persia had ever mustered was encamped across the plains of Boeotia, just north of Athens. Mardonius, Xerxes' hand-picked general and cousin by marriage, one of the primary architects of the initial invasion, commanded a force of roughly 100,000 men. This vast host comprised cavalry, infantry, and archers drawn from every far-flung corner of the sprawling Persian Empire. Across the field, the Greek coalition was on the verge of splintering before the battle had even commenced. City-states that had pledged soldiers were conspicuously pulling back their contingents. Supply lines were growing perilously thin. Commanders from different polis bickered incessantly over strategic positioning, over access to vital water sources, and over who would bear the burden of holding the most exposed wing. It was precisely the sort of internal chaos that has a tendency to unravel alliances long before the first javelin is ever hurled. Yet, amidst this profound disarray, holding the entire fragile coalition together through sheer force of authority, stood Pausanias. He was not, strictly speaking, a king. He served as regent, governing in place of Pleistarchus, the young son of Leonidas, who had famously perished at Thermopylae 3 years prior. Pausanias carried the immense weight of that heroic legacy with every order he issued. Every Greek soldier on that field knew whose throne he was keeping warm. But here's a crucial detail about Plataea that often escapes notice. The battle almost didn't unfold as it did. Mardonius had spent days relentlessly probing the Greek lines. His formidable cavalry had successfully severed their water supply at the Gargathian spring. The Greeks were compelled into a perilous nighttime withdrawal, a maneuver that, in the unforgiving realm of ancient warfare, ranked among the most hazardous an army could attempt. Units inevitably became separated. The Athenians drifted too far east. The Spartans found themselves isolated on a ridge near Plataea itself, dangerously exposed and overwhelmingly outnumbered. Mardonius, perceiving his moment, launched the full, crushing weight of his infantry directly at the beleaguered Spartan position. What transpired next both defined Pausanias and ultimately sealed his doom. The Spartans held their ground. Not because their plan was flawless, it demonstrably was not. Not because the terrain afforded them an advantage, quite the opposite. They held because Pausanias, with an astonishing and seemingly suicidal resolve, refused to issue the order to charge until the sacrificial omens were declared favorable. His men were enduring a torrent of arrow fire. Shields were splintering under the onslaught. Yet, Pausanias stood there, motionless, waiting. When he finally gave the long-awaited command, the Spartan line crashed into the Persian infantry with such devastating force that Mardonius himself was brought down, killed in the ferocious fighting. His personal guard, the elite immortals, broke and scattered. With Mardonius dead, the Persian army utterly collapsed, fragmenting from the center outwards. By the end of that day, the Persian invasion of Greece was decisively over. Pausanias had achieved something almost unparalleled in Greek history. He had commanded a multi-city coalition, held it steadfast against the very real threat of internal collapse, and delivered a decisive victory against the largest empire on earth. Such a monumental achievement can profoundly change a man, especially one who was never intended to be anything more than a temporary placeholder. Following Plataea, the Greek alliance did not immediately dissolve. Persian garrisons remained scattered across the Aegean, islands awaited liberation, and strategic choke points needed securing. It was Pausanias whom they dispatched for these crucial tasks. Cyprus swiftly fell. Then came Byzantium, the vital gateway between Europe and Asia, a city that controlled access to the lucrative Black Sea grain routes. Whoever commanded Byzantium wielded immense leverage over half the Greek world. Pausanias held Byzantium, and it was there that the first disturbing reports began to surface. Not yet about outright treason, but something quieter, something that in Sparta was almost more insidious. He had changed. His manner of dress shifted. Persian robes began to appear. A personal guard, composed not of Spartan soldiers, but of hired mercenaries, constantly surrounded him. Elaborate banquets replaced the austere, communal syssitia halls. He adopted mannerisms, protocols, and a style of authority that bore no resemblance to anything Sparta had ever cultivated. To the Ionian Greeks sailing under his command, this transformation was deeply unsettling. Several allied cities began dispatching complaints back to Sparta. These were not grievances about military failures, but rather about Pausanias's burgeoning arrogance, about a commander who was increasingly behaving less like a Spartan regent and more like the very Persian governors they had just finished overthrowing. Now, most historical accounts tend to simplify this part of the story, concluding that Pausanias simply became corrupt, that power had gone straight to his head. While that was undoubtedly part of the equation, there is a crucial detail that rarely receives adequate attention. In Byzantium, Pausanias had taken custody of several high-ranking Persian prisoners, nobles, even relatives of powerful satraps. These were men who, in the intricate economy of ancient warfare, represented enormous ransoms or invaluable political bargaining chips. Then, those prisoners vanished. They were released quietly, without any consultation, and without any record of ransom ever being paid. Pausanias claimed it was an oversight, a simple miscommunication with the garrison. Yet, nobody believed him. The only person who stood to benefit from sending high-ranking Persian nobles back to the empire was someone who wished the empire to owe him a favor. And this was the insidious question that began to circulate through Sparta's ruling council. What kind of favor was Pausanias expecting in return? That question would take years to answer. When the answer finally did arrive, it landed in the hands of a man who was never meant to read it. Sparta moved with characteristic caution. They did not dispatch an army. They did not issue a public accusation. Instead, they sent a message, a single, unambiguous line, as was Spartan custom, ordering Pausanias home. And, surprisingly, he came. That alone astonished many. A man with his own fleet, his own garrison, and control of one of the Mediterranean's most strategically vital cities. Yet he simply returned to Sparta when summoned. Perhaps he believed he could talk his way out of the trouble. Perhaps he thought they lacked any concrete evidence. Or perhaps, as some ancient sources suggest, he genuinely believed his monumental victory at Plataea still offered him an impenetrable shield. He was, it turned out, half right. The ephors, the 5 annually elected officials who wielded oversight power even over the kings, put him on trial. The charges were vague: misconduct, overreach, behavior unbecoming of a Spartan commander. Yet, nothing conclusive stuck. There was no hard evidence. The inexplicable release of the Persian prisoners was certainly suspicious, but suspicion alone did not secure a conviction in Sparta. The allied complaints about his behavior, while damaging, emanated from Ionians, and Sparta typically accorded little weight to the opinions of Ionians on anything of consequence. Consequently, they acquitted him. However, they did not send him back to Byzantium with his fleet. Instead, they stripped him of his command. The Allied naval operations were subsequently transferred to Athens, specifically to a commander named Aristides, and later to Cimon, son of Miltiades. This represented a pivotal turning point, eventually ceding control of the Delian League, the alliance that would soon become an Athenian empire in all but name, directly to Athens. Pausanias had lost his position. He had lost his fleet. He had lost Byzantium. Yet, without any official authorization, he returned anyway. He secured a single trireme, sailed to the Hellespont, took up residence in the city of Colone on the coast of the Troad, and began operating entirely independently. He ran his own campaigns, cultivated his own contacts. Sparta sent another message. This time, the tone was starkly different. Come home now, or be declared an enemy of the state. And still, he returned again, seemingly confident, seemingly untouched. But this time, something far more sinister followed him home. A trail of whispers that had nothing to do with Persian robes or missing prisoners. This insidious trail connected Pausanias to a conspiracy that, if proven true, would make his previous dealings with Persia seem utterly trivial by comparison. There is a facet of this story that most retellings either gloss over or mention only in passing, precisely because it complicates the simpler narrative. Pausanias was not merely accused of negotiating with Persia, he was also allegedly negotiating with the Helots. If you are unfamiliar with what that implies, you must understand its profound significance. Sparta's entire civilization was predicated upon a brutal system of forced labor. The Helots, a subjugated population largely descended from the original inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, outnumbered Spartan citizens by a margin that ancient sources estimated anywhere from 7:1 to a staggering 20:1. They toiled the land, produced the food, and carried supplies in wartime. Crucially, they were never, at any point, truly free. Sparta's greatest, most consuming fear, the very thing that shaped its entire military culture, its rigid social structure, its obsessive discipline, was a Helot uprising. The Cryptia, Sparta's notorious secret police, existed specifically to identify and eliminate potential Helot leaders before any revolt could possibly organize itself. Now, imagine the seismic effect of a single rumor. Pausanias is promising the Helots their freedom. It scarcely mattered whether it was true. The accusation alone was earth-shattering. For if Pausanias, a regent, a member of the Agiad royal house, a man with deep and extensive connections inside Sparta's military elite, had even hinted at offering Helot emancipation in exchange for their support in some audacious power grab, then Sparta was not dealing with a rogue general. They were staring down an existential threat to their very way of life. And this is where the historical timeline becomes somewhat entangled, as our primary ancient sources, Thucydides and Plutarch, do not entirely agree on how much of this was genuinely real and how much might have been fabricated by Pausanias' powerful enemies. Thucydides mentions the Helot connection almost in passing, as though it were common knowledge of the era. Plutarch accords it more weight, but frames it with greater caution and nuance. What we can ascertain is this. The Ephors now held two damning threads. The Persian negotiations, still unproven but deeply suspicious, and the Helot conspiracy, terrifying in its implications but as yet uncorroborated. Either accusation alone was sufficient cause to watch him with extreme vigilance. Taken together, they transformed Pausanias into the most dangerous man in Sparta. But mere vigilance was no longer enough. They desperately needed irrefutable proof. And that proof was about to walk directly through the gates of Sparta, carrying a letter that he was never supposed to survive reading. His name has been lost to history. What endures is his critical action and its profound motivation. Pausanias had been utilizing personal couriers to communicate with Artabazus, a powerful Persian satrap who served as the intermediary between the audacious Greek regent and the royal court of Xerxes I. These were not official dispatches. They were private letters carried by men Pausanias himself selected, men whose loyalty lay with him, not with Sparta. The system functioned seamlessly until this particular messenger noticed something profoundly unsettling. None of the previous couriers had ever returned. Every man sent to deliver a letter to Artabazus had simply vanished. No return message, no reassignment, no trace, just an ominous silence. So, before he departed, he carefully opened the letter. Inside, he found precisely what the Ephors had been so desperately seeking. Pausanias was writing directly to Xerxes, or to his representatives, offering to bring Greece under Persian control. In return, Pausanias desired a position of immense authority. Some sources suggest he explicitly requested marriage into the Persian royal family, a union with Xerxes' own daughter. Others state the terms were vaguer, but the underlying intent was identical. Personal power, guaranteed by Persian backing, in exchange for the subjugation of Greece. And at the very bottom of the letter, one chilling final line, an instruction to kill the messenger. Once the delivery was made, he was, in effect, carrying his own death warrant. The messenger, understandably, did not deliver the letter. Instead, he turned around and brought it directly to the ephors. Now, this should have been the definitive end. A written letter, in Pausanias' own hand, detailing negotiations with the very empire that had attempted to burn Athens to the ground less than a decade earlier. It should have been enough. But the ephors hesitated, not because they doubted the letter's authenticity, but because of what Pausanias still represented. He remained a member of the revered Aegead royal house. He was still the hero of Plataea. Arresting him publicly, solely on the strength of a single letter carried by a man who might have his own hidden motives for fabrication, carried immense risks, political risks, social risks, the kind of risks that could irrevocably fracture Sparta's meticulously balanced ruling class. So, instead of immediate arrest, they devised a cunning trap. And this trap required one extraordinarily dangerous thing from the messenger: to return to Pausanias, confront him, and compel him to utter his confession aloud. The plan was deceptively simple in concept, yet extraordinarily perilous in its execution. The messenger would arrange a meeting with Pausanias. He would feign distress, confusion about the letter's contents, and profound fear about what he had read, pleading for reassurance. While they spoke, the ephors would be listening, hidden. They prepared a trench. The ancient sources described this differently. Thucydides, for instance, states the ephors concealed themselves behind a partition or within a divided space near the designated meeting point. The underlying objective, however, remained the same: hidden officials, close enough to hear every damning word. The messenger played his part perfectly. He confronted Pausanias, produced the letter, revealed what he had read, expressed his terror, and then Pausanias, instead of vehemently denying it, instead of claiming the letter was a forgery, instead of attempting any of the obvious strategies that might have saved him, confirmed everything. He did not shout. He did not threaten. According to Thucydides' account, he calmly attempted to placate the messenger. He reassured him. He promised him protection. He urged him to proceed with the delivery as planned, asserting that no harm would come to him. Every single word landed precisely in the ears of the ephors, sitting in the clandestine darkness. They finally had what they needed. But here is the detail that truly illuminates how Sparta functioned, often quite differently from its public image of unyielding, iron discipline. They did not arrest him that night. They withdrew. They reconvened. They debated what course of action to take, even with a first-hand confession still echoing in their minds. For in Sparta, moving against a man of Pausanias' extraordinary rank demanded absolute consensus. It required not just certainty that the act was justified, but absolute assurance that the ensuing political fallout could be effectively contained. By the time they finally made their move, Pausanias had already sensed that something was amiss. And when the ephors eventually came for him, he was already running. He did not run far. He simply could not. Sparta was not a walled city in the traditional sense, but it was a profoundly closed society. There was no harbor to flee to, no foreign quarter to disappear into, no allied faction willing to shelter a man accused of conspiring with Persia, and, even worse, agitating the Helots. So Pausanias ran to the one place in Sparta where the rules of man seemingly yielded to the rules of the gods, the temple of Athena Chalkioikos, Athena of the Bronze House, on the Acropolis. This was sacred ground. In Greek religious law, anyone who entered a temple and formally claimed the protection of the gods became a suppliant. Killing a suppliant inside a temple was an act of profound sacrilege, a violation that did not merely anger the gods, but was believed to pollute the entire community, inviting divine wrath in the form of plagues, crop failures, or military defeats. The Greeks did not treat divine pollution as a mere metaphor. They treated it as a literal cause and effect. Pausanias understood this implicitly. Every Spartan knew this, and the ephors knew it too. So, they halted at the temple entrance. For a moment, perhaps longer, a tense standoff ensued. Pausanias was inside, breathing heavily, pressed against the altar or the inner walls. The ephors were outside, armed with the full authority to arrest him, yet bound by a religious prohibition that even they dared not override. They couldn't enter. They couldn't drag him out. So, they devised another solution. They began to dismantle the roof. Piece by painstaking piece, they stripped the timber and tiles from the top of the temple, exposing the interior to the open sky. The theological logic, if one can call it that, was chillingly precise. They were not entering the sacred space. They were not spilling blood on holy ground. They were merely rendering the sanctuary less effective as a shelter. Then, they commenced work on the entrance itself. Stones, bricks, whatever materials were readily available. Layer by meticulous layer, they sealed the doorway shut. And the man who had held the line at Plataea, who had watched the mighty Persian Empire shatter against Spartan shields, stood trapped inside a holy edifice, watching the light narrow to a mere slit, then to a crack, and finally, to utter darkness. There is one particularly poignant detail that survives across multiple ancient sources, and it is the one most difficult to explain away. As the entrance was being sealed, an old woman approached, Pausanias' own mother. The sources do not agree on her name. Some do not name her at all. What they unanimously agree on is her action. She did not speak to him. She did not plead for mercy. She made no attempt to intercede with the ephors. She neither collapsed in grief nor screamed curses at the men walling in her son. Instead, she stoically picked up a stone, carried it to the entrance, set it firmly in place, and then simply walked away. After that chilling display, any lingering hesitation among the onlookers vanished. If his own mother had delivered such a stark, unambiguous judgment, then there was truly nothing left to debate. The wall closed completely. No food was passed through. No water. No communication whatsoever. The ancient sources recount that they waited, not for mere hours, but for days, until the sounds from within the sealed temple finally ceased. Until there was nothing but silence behind the stone. Then, they opened a section of the wall, just enough to retrieve the body. They pulled him out, barely clinging to life, according to one account, dying within moments of being exposed to the open air. And then, as if nothing untoward had happened, they sealed the temple once more. In Sparta, the initial expectation was simple. The problem had been definitively solved. A traitor had been identified, cornered, and eliminated without a single drop of blood being spilled on sacred ground. The religious law, they believed, had been technically observed. The political threat had been neutralized. The Helots had lost their alleged champion. Clean. Except it wasn't. Almost immediately, things began to go wrong. The oracle at Delphi, the single most authoritative religious voice in the entire Greek world, unequivocally declared that Sparta had incurred divine pollution. Not for executing a traitor, for that was just, but for the manner of his death, for allowing a man to die as a suppliant within a sacred precinct. Regardless of their meticulously crafted technicalities, the gods, it seemed, cared little for loopholes. Sparta was explicitly ordered to make atonement. The form that atonement took is particularly striking. They commissioned 2 bronze statues and had them placed either within or very near the temple precinct. Some sources even suggest these statues were intended to represent Pausanias himself, a memorial to the very man they had just meticulously killed. Consider that for a moment. The same state that had sealed him inside a temple and patiently waited for silence, then turned around and erected statues in his honor. Not because they had a sudden change of heart about what he had done, but because the spiritual and political cost of how they had done it proved to be far higher than they had ever calculated. Pausanias was eventually buried, afforded proper rites, treated in death with the kind of respect that had been systematically denied to him in his final living hours. The larger consequences of his downfall, however, played out over decades. Sparta's loss of allied confidence, which had begun when Pausanias alienated the Ionians, accelerated rapidly. Athens deftly filled the power vacuum. The Delian League consolidated its strength, and the inexorable power shift that would ultimately lead to the cataclysmic Peloponnesian War gained crucial momentum from precisely this period. One man's downfall certainly did not cause that colossal war, but it undeniably opened a door that Sparta would spend the next 50 years desperately trying to close. Pausanias died in silence, behind a wall of stone, inside a building dedicated to the very goddess of wisdom. Whether he was guilty of everything they accused him of, or only some of it, or even none of it, ceased to matter the moment the first stone was laid. For the decision had already been made, and it was never truly about what Pausanias had done. It was, rather, about what Sparta simply could not afford to let him become.